On the evening of August 15, 1971, tens of millions of American households turned on their television sets to watch President Richard Nixon interrupt a Sunday broadcast and announce that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. The version of this story that made it into the textbooks treats it as a sudden reversal, a president cornered by Vietnam War spending, rising inflation, and a run on American gold reserves, forced into an emergency decision with no real alternative left on the table. It is remembered as a rupture, the moment one administration broke a promise that had anchored the world's money for 27 years. Most survey courses on 20th century economic history still teach the episode this way, as a single presidential decision, responding to a single acute crisis, with Nixon's own Treasury Secretary quoted as the man who delivered the final verdict, rather than as one of several officials finishing an obituary for a system that had been dying in installments since the previous decade. The financial record shows something else. The dollar's convertibility into gold did not fail over a weekend at Camp David in 1971. It failed in 1960, in a paper almost nobody outside a narrow circle of economists read when it was first published, and it failed again in 1968, when the central banks defending the official gold price quietly stopped defending it. What happened during that broadcast was not a collapse, it was an announcement, arriving 3.5 years late, of a collapse the system's own architects had already recorded in private memoranda the public would never see, and in most cases, never learn had existed at all. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Most retellings treat the Bretton Woods system as a single continuous arrangement that lasted from 1944 until Nixon ended it. The internal record kept by the men who ran it tells a different story, one with at least two distinct phases hiding inside a single name. The first, running roughly from 1945 through the mid-1950s, suffered from too few dollars in circulation, not too many, as a devastated Europe scrambled for the currency it needed simply to buy food and machinery. The second phase, the one that actually broke, emerged only once post-war Europe and Japan had rebuilt their industrial capacity and started running trade surpluses against the United States rather than deficits. The dollar shortage of the late 1940s had, within 20 years, become a dollar glut that nobody in Washington had built a mechanism to absorb. To understand what actually broke, you have to go back to a resort hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in July of 1944, where 730 delegates from 44 allied nations gathered for 3 weeks to design the monetary system that would govern the post-war world. Two men dominated the negotiations, and they wanted very different things. John Maynard Keynes, representing a Britain already stripped of its financial supremacy by war debt, proposed an international reserve currency he called the Bancor, managed by a global clearing union, deliberately built so that no single nation's currency would sit at the center of the system, and no single treasury would hold that kind of leverage over everyone else. Harry Dexter White, representing a United States that held roughly 2/3 of the world's monetary gold at the time, proposed something narrower, and from Washington's chair, considerably more useful. The dollar itself would become the world's reserve asset, fixed to gold at $35 an ounce, the same rate Franklin Roosevelt had set 7 years earlier under the Gold Reserve Act. Every other currency would peg itself to the dollar at a rate that was fixed but, in theory, adjustable with the fund's approval. Only the dollar would carry a direct promise of gold, and even that promise applied only to foreign governments and central banks, never to private citizens holding dollars at home or abroad. The delegates met inside the Mount Washington Hotel for 3 weeks that July, working in committee rooms late into the night while the war in Europe was still being fought outside the hotel's windows. Keynes arrived already frail from the heart condition that would kill him 2 years later, and he pushed the Bancor proposal with the full weight of his reputation, arguing that any system anchored to a single national currency would eventually force the rest of the world to accept whatever domestic policy that one country's government chose to run. White, backed by a Treasury delegation representing the only major economy to emerge from the war with its industrial base intact, did not need to win the argument on its merits. He needed only to point out that the United States held the gold, the delegates needed the loans, and the conference would end the way the country writing the checks wanted it to end. Keynes lost the argument, not because the Bancor was poorly designed, but because Britain, drowning in wartime debt to the United States, had no leverage left with which to insist on it. White, for his part, would not live to see the full consequences of the system he designed. He died in 1948, 3 years after Bretton Woods closed, and it was only decades later, when American cryptographers declassified the wartime Venona intercepts in the 1990s, that the record showed White had passed sensitive information to Soviet intelligence during the very years he was drafting the post-war monetary order. That detail rarely makes it into accounts of the conference, but it belongs in the ledger, because it shows how much of the system's founding architecture was decided by a handful of men operating with agendas the public record would not catch up to for half a century. The agreement that emerged from those 3 weeks created the International Monetary Fund and the institution that would become the World Bank, and it installed the dollar as the single hinge on which every other currency on Earth would swing. Each member nation was assigned a quota, paid partly in gold and partly in its own currency, which determined both its voting weight inside the fund and how much it could borrow from the common pool if its own currency came under pressure. For the arrangement to function day to day, the world needed a steadily growing supply of dollars to hold as reserves and to finance an expanding volume of international trade. For those dollars to remain trustworthy, the United States needed to hold enough gold to make good on every claim against it, at least in principle. Those two requirements looked compatible in 1944, when American gold reserves were enormous and the rest of the industrial world lay in physical ruins. They would not stay compatible for long, and the men who wrote the agreement's fine print did not need a crystal ball to see it coming. They needed only to read their own numbers forward by 15 years. The word adjustable in the phrase adjustable peg did most of its work on paper rather than in practice. Devaluing a currency carried a political stigma that few finance ministers were willing to absorb, since it read publicly as an admission of national economic failure, so governments across the system tended to defend an increasingly unrealistic rate for years past the point their own reserves justified it, then adjust all at once in a crisis rather than in small increments along the way. Britain's own 1967 devaluation, discussed later in this account, followed exactly that pattern, and so, eventually, did the dollars. The agreement's drafters had actually anticipated part of the strain, if not the scale of it. Article 6 of the fund's founding charter explicitly permitted member governments to impose controls on the movement of capital across their borders, a provision Keynes had insisted on precisely because he expected that free-flowing speculative capital would eventually overwhelm any fixed exchange rate a government tried to defend. For the system's first 15 years, most European governments used exactly that authority, restricting how freely money could leave the country and buying the fixed peg time it would not otherwise have had. As those controls were gradually loosened through the 1960s, in step with the same reconstruction that turned Europe's dollar shortage into a dollar glut, the very mechanism built to protect the peg was dismantled by the governments that depended on it, years before Washington ever touched the gold price itself. The first real tremor arrived in October of 1960, weeks before John Kennedy's election, when nervous private demand pushed the free market price of gold in London briefly above $40 an ounce, well past the official rate. Kennedy's transition team scrambled to reassure foreign governments that the United States had no intention of devaluing, and the incoming administration spent its first weeks in office drafting a formal pledge to defend the $35 price by whatever means necessary. It was the first public sign, years before most economists were willing to say so on the record, that private markets had already started pricing in a mismatch that official Washington was still calling a temporary imbalance. By 1960, a Belgian-born economist teaching at Yale, named Robert Triffin, had already worked out exactly why that mismatch existed. Triffin had spent years advising European institutions on post-war reconstruction before turning his attention to the dollar's role in the system he had helped build in a smaller way himself, and his congressional testimony that year was delivered not as speculation, but as an extension of arithmetic that any Treasury desk could check against its own books. In that testimony, and in a short book titled Gold and the Dollar Crisis, Triffin described a structural bind that the profession would later name after him, though he never used that phrase himself. To supply the world with the dollars it needed for a growing volume of trade and reserves, the United States had to run persistent balance of payments deficits, sending more dollars abroad than it took in. But every dollar sent abroad was, in principle, a claim on a fixed and shrinking pool of American gold. Run the deficits long enough to supply global liquidity, and foreign holdings of dollars would eventually exceed the gold available to redeem them. Stop running the deficits to protect the gold, and the world would starve for the reserves it needed to keep trading and growing at all. There was no configuration of the system, Triffin argued, in which both conditions could hold at once indefinitely. The peg was not fragile because of any single bad decision made by any single administration. It was fragile because its own architecture manufactured the shortage that would eventually kill it, and it had been manufacturing that shortage since the ink dried at Bretton Woods. Congress heard Triffin's warning and largely filed it away. The response that actually followed was not a redesign of the system, it was an effort to paper over the arithmetic for as long as possible. In November of 1961, the United States organized 7 other central banks, Britain, West Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland into an arrangement that came to be known as the London Gold Pool, coordinated quietly through the Bank of England's own trading desk rather than through any public treaty. Its function was simple, and for a while it worked. Whenever private demand pushed the market price of gold above $35 an ounce, member banks pooled their bullion and sold into the open market until the price settled back down. Whenever demand slackened, the pool bought gold back and divided the purchases among its members according to a fixed formula tied to each country's original contribution. Alongside the pool, the New York Federal Reserve's chief foreign exchange officer, Charles Coombs, built a parallel network of currency swap lines with the same central banks starting in 1962 so that dollars could be pulled temporarily out of circulation abroad without forcing an immediate reckoning over gold. Both arrangements did the same underlying job. They let the official world treat $35 an ounce as a natural price, when in truth it was an increasingly artificial one, held in place by coordinated intervention rather than by any real balance between the supply of dollars in circulation and the supply of gold sitting in vaults. American spending choices made the underlying arithmetic worse with each passing year. Lyndon Johnson's administration financed the war in Vietnam and the domestic programs of the Great Society at the same time, a combination contemporaries called guns and butter, without raising taxes to match either commitment. The dollars required to cover both kept flowing out of the country, adding to the very foreign reserves Triffin had warned about, at a pace no gold pool could offset indefinitely through market operations alone. West Germany's Bundesbank, sitting on a large and growing dollar surplus from its own trade position, came under direct pressure from Washington not to convert those dollars into gold and worsen the drain. In March of 1967, Bundesbank President Karl Blessing wrote a private letter to the Federal Reserve pledging that Germany would not seek gold in exchange for its dollar holdings, a commitment that kept the system alive for a few more years, but that depended entirely on the goodwill of one foreign central bank rather than on any actual monetary discipline in Washington. The letter was never put to a public vote in Bonn, and it committed a democratic government's reserves to a foreign policy of restraint that its own taxpayers never formally endorsed, a quiet accommodation that historians of the period would later cite as one of the clearest examples of how much the entire system depended on informal understandings between a handful of officials rather than on any binding treaty obligation. France refused to extend the same courtesy, and it refused on purpose. Charles de Gaulle had never accepted the post-war arrangement on Washington's terms. His economic advisor Jacques Rueff had spent much of his career arguing for a full return to a gold standard and against what French officials were now calling the dollar's exorbitant privilege, the ability of the United States to settle its debts abroad simply by printing more of its own currency, rather than by earning foreign exchange the way every other government had to. At a press conference in February of 1965, de Gaulle said in public what Rueff had been arguing in private for years, that the dollar's role gave America a form of credit no other nation enjoyed, and that the arrangement could not last on those terms indefinitely. France began converting a portion of its dollar reserves into gold at the official rate not long after, and accounts from the period describe French gold shipments leaving vaults in New York and crossing the Atlantic back to Paris, a slow and deliberate repatriation that had no real precedent among America's post-war allies. French naval vessels reportedly carried some of the repatriated bullion home rather than trusting the shipment to commercial carriers, a detail that made its way into French press coverage at the time, and that Rueff himself cited approvingly, in his later writing, as evidence that Paris no longer trusted Washington's paper promises over the physical metal sitting quietly in its own vaults. In June of 1967, France withdrew from the gold pool entirely, unwilling to keep subsidizing the defense of a price it had already concluded was fictional. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The pool did not survive France's exit for long. Britain devalued the pound in November of 1967, and speculative pressure on gold intensified through the following winter as traders bet openly against the official rate. By March of 1968, the remaining members were selling bullion into the market at a pace no coalition of central banks could sustain, and on the 17th of that month they abandoned the joint defense altogether. What replaced it was a two-tier system, an official price of $35 an ounce, used only in transactions between central banks and governments, and a separate free market price, left to float according to ordinary supply and demand, which traded well above the official rate almost immediately. This is the gap the standard account skips over entirely. The two-tier system created in March of 1968 was not a minor technical adjustment. It was an admission made by the world's leading central banks 3.5 years before Nixon ever spoke on television, that the official gold price no longer reflected anything real. Convertibility survived after that only as a courtesy extended to a shrinking number of foreign governments willing to treat the formality as though it still carried weight. By the end of the decade, the mismatch Triffin had described in theory had become a set of figures any Treasury official could read on a single page. American gold reserves, which had stood near $20 billion in the years just after the war, had fallen to roughly $10 billion by 1971. Dollar claims held by foreign governments and central banks, the very reserves the Bretton Woods system had spent 2 decades encouraging them to accumulate, had grown past $50 billion over the same period. The United States could not have honored even a modest fraction of those claims in gold if more than a handful of foreign governments had asked for redemption at once, and every finance ministry in the developed world understood this well before 1971 arrived. The question inside the Treasury and the Federal Reserve was never whether the arrangement would break. It had already broken, quietly, in 1968. The only open question left was who would be blamed for saying so out loud, and when they would finally say it. The International Monetary Fund's own membership had, in fact, already conceded the point in writing. In 1969, the fund's member governments created a new reserve asset called the Special Drawing Right, allocated directly to member countries rather than tied to either gold production or American balance of payments deficits. The stated purpose was to supplement, not replace gold and the dollar as reserve assets, but the underlying admission was harder to disguise. If the world's official liquidity could safely be created by a vote of the fund's membership, then the entire premise on which the dollar had been anchored to gold 25 years earlier, that reserves had to be scarce and convertible to hold their value, had already quietly given way inside the very institution built to defend it. By the summer of 1971, the men managing what remained of the system were no longer debating whether the gold window could hold. They were debating how to close it without setting off a wider panic across currency markets that were already jittery from years of speculation. Treasury Secretary John Connolly, a Texan with little patience for the caution that career economists brought to the table, wanted a decisive and public break. Paul Volcker, the Treasury's Undersecretary for Monetary Affairs and a far more reluctant participant in what was coming, had spent years trying to negotiate a gradual reform of the system from the inside, and later described the plan he helped design as something closer to a controlled demolition than a sudden accident forced by circumstance. As early as 1969, Volcker had quietly assembled a small working group inside Treasury to study contingency options for an eventual suspension of convertibility, a project that stayed almost entirely out of public view until Volcker described it himself years afterward. The group's early papers reportedly treated suspension not as a worst-case scenario to be avoided at all costs, but as one plausible outcome among several, worth planning for on its own terms, precisely because the balance of payments numbers were already trending in a single direction, with no realistic policy path back to the old equilibrium. Federal Reserve Chairman Arthur Burns worried openly, in meetings that were not made public at the time, about the message a formal suspension would send to allies who had spent 27 years treating the dollar's convertibility as the cornerstone of American credibility abroad. Nixon's own political calendar shaped the timing as much as any external speculative pressure did. With a re-election campaign approaching in 1972, he wanted an economy free to expand without the discipline that gold convertibility and a fixed exchange rate would otherwise have imposed on domestic policy, and closing the gold window removed that discipline in a single afternoon. On the 13th of August 1971, Nixon summoned 15 advisors to Camp David for a weekend of closed-door meetings, cut off from Congress and from the Allied governments who would be most directly affected, and it was there that the final shape of the announcement was settled. The broadcast that followed 2 days later bundled the suspension of gold convertibility, together with a 90-day freeze on wages and prices and a 10% surcharge on imports, a package the administration branded the new economic policy. The bundling mattered more than it appeared to at the time. It let Nixon present the gold decision as one plank in a broader plan to fight inflation at home, rather than as the final and overdue default on a promise the country had already been unable to keep in practice since March of 1968. Several major European foreign exchange markets simply closed their doors for days after the broadcast, rather than try to price currencies against a dollar that no longer had any fixed relationship to anything, a paralysis that later economic histories tend to compress into a single sentence, but that, at the time, left traders across Frankfurt, Paris, and Tokyo with no reliable rate at which to conduct ordinary business. European governments, who had not been consulted before the broadcast aired, understood immediately what had actually happened, whatever language the White House chose to wrap around it. When finance ministers from the Group of 10 gathered in Rome that November to negotiate a replacement arrangement, Connolly told them plainly that the dollar was America's currency, and now their problem. A line that circulated through European finance ministries for years afterward, as shorthand for exactly how one-sided the post-war bargain had always been, dressed up as a shared international order. The Smithsonian Agreement, signed at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington in December of 1971, was the industrialized world's attempt to patch the arrangement rather than abandon it outright. The dollar was devalued against gold for the first time since 1934, moving from $35 an ounce to $38, and the trading bans permitted around other currencies were widened to give central banks more room to intervene before the next crisis forced their hand again. Nixon called it the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world. It lasted 14 months. By February of 1973, the dollar needed a second devaluation to $42.22 an ounce, and within weeks, the major industrial currencies abandoned fixed exchange rates altogether and let them float against one another, a system that has persisted, with modifications, ever since. Bretton Woods, in any operational sense, ended not on that August evening in 1971, but in this second, quieter surrender 18 months later, one that received a fraction of the press coverage Nixon's original broadcast had generated, and almost none of the textbook attention. The admission that the deeper problem had been visible for over a decade came, when it finally came, from the people who had spent those years managing it, rather than from any single dramatic disclosure. Volcker's own memoir, written with Toyu Gyoten and published 2 decades after the fact, described the Camp David weekend not as an improvised response to a sudden emergency, but as the execution of contingency planning that Treasury officials had been quietly refining since at least the mid-1960s, precisely because they understood, in language Triffin had already supplied them a decade earlier, that the gold peg's failure was a matter of arithmetic rather than politics. Economists who had dismissed Triffin's book in 1960 as excessively pessimistic, arguing that a currency as widely trusted as the dollar would never actually face a run on its convertibility, spent the 1970s and 80s folding the phrase Triffin Dilemma into standard university textbooks instead, an academic vindication that arrived only after the system it described had already come apart in full public view, and after Triffin himself had spent a decade watching officials in Washington treat his warning as an interesting hypothesis rather than an operating constraint. Rueff, for his part, lived to see the gold standard he had championed for decades vindicated in outcome, if not restored in practice, and spent his final years writing that the entire post-war arrangement had been, in his own words, a monetary sin the West would eventually be forced to confess in full. What the mechanism produced once it was finally gone has proven far more durable than the popular retelling of 1971 usually suggests. The end of gold convertibility did not weaken the dollar's position at the center of the world's financial architecture. It removed the one constraint that had ever limited it. Freed from any obligation to redeem its currency in a fixed and finite asset, the United States could finance deficits, wars, and domestic spending programs by issuing debt denominated in its own money, confident that the rest of the world would keep absorbing that debt because the dollar remained the currency in which oil, commodities, and the overwhelming majority of international trade were priced and settled. The institution built at Bretton Woods to police a gold-linked system did not disappear when that system finally gave out. The International Monetary Fund, created in 1944 to oversee fixed exchange rates and gold convertibility, simply changed its function. It became the manager of a floating rate world instead, and increasingly the lender of last resort for the debt crises that a purely fiat system now produces on a schedule its founders at Bretton Woods never anticipated and likely could not have imagined. Gold's formal demonetization was completed at the Jamaica Accords of 1976, when the fund's member governments quietly amended its own charter to strip gold of any official role in the system at all, closing out a demotion that had, in practice, already been underway since the collapse of the gold pool 8 years earlier. Within a decade, that same institution was managing sovereign debt crises across Latin America that grew directly out of the recycled dollar liquidity a floating, gold-free system now produced in volumes the original architects of Bretton Woods never planned for. Within months of the final break from gold in 1973, the same dollar, now backed by nothing more than the promise of the United States government, became the currency in which the world's oil was priced and settled, an arrangement negotiated separately with Saudi Arabia and the wider Gulf that would recycle oil revenue back into American Treasury securities for decades to come. A system once anchored to a fixed weight of metal was replaced by one anchored to nothing more concrete than the world's continued willingness to hold dollars, a willingness that has occasionally been tested since, most recently by governments openly discussing alternatives to dollar settlement, but that has yet to be replaced by anything the financial record shows working at comparable scale. The transition to floating rates was not smooth in the way later summaries tend to suggest. In June of 1974, a mid-sized German lender called Bankhaus Herstatt collapsed after its foreign exchange traders ran up losses betting against the newly volatile dollar, and its failure exposed a settlement gap in the floating system so severe that international banking regulators spent years afterward redesigning how cross-border currency trades were cleared, a problem that simply had not existed under fixed rates. Germany's own relationship with its gold reserves would resurface decades later in an echo of France's 1960s suspicion when the Bundesbank announced in 2013 that it would repatriate a large share of the gold it had stored in vaults at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York since the Cold War, a decision German officials attributed to a desire for direct physical oversight of assets that had, for half a century, existed for most practical purposes as an entry on someone else's ledger. The operation took years longer than originally planned and drew public questions in the German press about why a wealthy, allied nation needed nearly 4 years simply to bring its own gold home, questions that were never entirely answered to the satisfaction of the officials asking them. The gold window that closed on television in August of 1971 had already been effectively closed for 3.5 years, since the moment 8 central banks stopped defending a price they no longer believed in. What the public saw that Sunday evening was a president making a hard call under sudden pressure, delivered in a calm, confident tone that gave no hint of the years of internal paperwork behind it. What the financial record shows, once the memoranda, the testimony, and the private letters between central bankers are placed beside the broadcast itself, is a structure that had been failing by design since the summer of 1944, a failure identified with precision by an economist Washington chose not to act on, defended past its natural life by a pool of central banks that eventually refused to keep paying for the pretense, and finally abandoned not because the country ran out of options but because the men managing the abandonment had run out of time to keep pretending there were any left. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.